Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Well, studies have long linked gender and racial equity to better improved business and financial performance, as well as myriad other benefits across industries. But the Inflation Reduction Act brings the issue front and center in a way that has never been seen before. So taking historic steps toward addressing the systemic inequities that have put low-income communities and communities of color at the forefront of the environmental burden. The IRA introduced new programs to incentivize, for example, low-cost solar, EV ownership, access to mobility, grants for resilience, public health programs, and lots more for low-income and economically disadvantaged communities. The IRA is just one proof point among many that to work on climate is to work on equity. Women in Climate Tech is today honored to welcome this expert panel to address equity in climate tech and hiring strategies. So we're structuring our panel along the chronological experience that recruits have to a company, beginning with, if you're a company and you want a strategy, a DE&I strategy, where do you even begin? We'll start there, and then we'll talk through some of the recruiting strategies that are involved in implementing your goals. We'll talk about case studies of best practices in recruiting and equity. And then Dr. Tots will finish us off with her experience working in DE&I in a forward-facing role, working with communities, as well as internally. So I want to introduce our speakers today. Quionna Allen is CEO of Caldwell Allen Consulting and co-founder of Beyond Racial Equity. She'll be setting the stage, talking about where do you even begin. We'll move to Catherine McLean next. She's founder and CEO of Dillon Green. She'll be discussing best recruiting practices with an eye to equity, both for job seekers and also for hiring companies. Beth Gullette is Chief People Officer at Well. She will talk about best practices for embedding equity in business, and she'll also discuss the when to hire rubric, or the decision rubric for hiring in the type of companies we're dealing with, which tend to be very high growth, very fast, very bumpy. And then Dr. Height is DI Director of the American Forest Foundation, and they will discuss the strategies for embedding equity internally and beyond, extending into a company's wider world of clients and stakeholders. So without further ado, Quionna, I'd love to kick it off to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. And I appreciate the question, where to start in this work. And so if there's, there's so many places to start, but one of the places that we, talked with our clients about, and what we ask and what we've implemented from a framework perspective, is really starting with education and learning. And the reason that we ask our groups to start with education and learning and collective learning. And so what we find is that people are in different places in terms of what they know about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they've had different experiences that, obviously inform actions that people want to take. But it's really important to start with a collective learning. And so whether it's a book that the group goes through together, whether it's a formal course that the team takes together, but it's really about having a learning experience that, the group, the team, the two are going through together. And what that does is it gives the ability to have a common language. But what we also find is it can help align on what are the outcomes, like what's the purpose of the work, what's the why, what will these efforts move towards, and can help clarify, what that will look like. So we focus on, and so, starting point is education. Second from that is reflection. After that is collective discussion. planning, and then moving into deliberate action. And going in that going in that framework or that format can really help align a group on what it is that they're solving for. I would also like to emphasize in starting this work is focusing on outcomes. Oftentimes we'll have strategies and ideas and tactics and actions that we're ready to move forward with, but we don't step back and think about, well, what's the outcome connected to that? What is that hiring strategy really meant to enable, right? And so it may mean that your hiring strategy is really focused on diverse representation, and that's an important outcome, whether it's for your leadership team or whether it's for staff level positions, but it's really being clear about what is that outcome that strategy or that effort is meant to enable, to support, to create. And then finally, I'll just offer taking small and consistent steps. So this is a journey that we're on. It is not a race. We're not going to, undo centuries of inequities in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year. And so it's really important that organizations and teams take small and consistent steps, even if it feels like it's not moving as fast as they would like. And but transformation happens as we take those small, consistent steps. We look up a year later and we're way further along than we would have been had we tried to have sort of a big, big bang or big effort in the work.
I had two quick questions to follow up on that. Well, first of all, in our preparation calls, everybody universally recommended the book DE&I Deconstructed.
Yes.
Is that an example of a book that you would have a team read and possibly discuss? And then my second question is, how large of a team do you suggest? Is it company-wide, or do you break it down into teams, smaller groups? How should a founder think about that?
So there are a couple of things. One, DEI Deconstructed is outstanding for how to think about and implement a DEI strategy and what that should look like within an organization. I would recommend, so in terms of collective learning, something that was really going to help understand how and why we have the disparities that we have. And so a recommendation, or what we use in our work to help with that, is a documentary series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And so it tracks like historical perspectives of laws and decisions and redlining and, GI bills and who was eligible for, housing loans, and Supreme Court decisions. Like, it just goes over quite a bit of information that can help really, frame the issues that we're really solving for. The Racial Equity Institute does a fabulous job of outlining in their groundwater example what we're solving for. So I would recommend those types of education, series or activities to really clarify what are we really solving for with this work. And then the DEI Deconstructed book, Lily's saying they do a great job of just highlighting so many different aspects of this work. What are definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we think about outcomes? How do we talk about this work? What an organization should be focused on? So those are things that come to mind. And then your question around size and who should engage in this work, it really depends on the size of the organization. If it's a smaller team, invite all to participate. If it's a larger organization, I would defer to thoughts about change management and how we want to engage the early adopters, those who already have enthusiasm and excitement around this work, and support them in leading in leading this work for the organization and bringing people along through conversation, through education, through actions to build support for what's going on in the organization. It can be discouraging, difficult, challenging to convince people that this is the right thing to do. So I would say start with those who have a heart for this work, who have a desire for this work, build out, have small wins, and bring people along.
That's so interesting that you talk about change management. I read several years ago now, Managing Transitions, which is a very popular book on change management, because I was so interested in climate change as an epic change management. And so, experience for every company. And so I find it so interesting because you're right. This is a change management exercise and it's not easy. It does take time. That was so helpful. And I just want to emphasize to our listeners that we'll be putting forward the names and the contact information of all of our speakers, plus a good list of resources that they've all recommended to me in our next newsletter. So look out for that. That'll be early next week. And Quionna, companies hire you to do this, to help them on this journey. Did I say that right?
Yes.
This is a consulting firm. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, I want to move next to Catherine, who very kindly a while ago, a couple of months ago, in fact, I started seeing data from the Women in Climate Tech survey, salary survey. It showed a significant discrepancy between the pay of people who identified as of color and people who identified as white. And that was very discouraging to me. And I wanted to ask questions of people who are in recruiting and development to ask, what could be going on here and what could we suggest to do differently. And Catherine gave me some good thoughts. And I wanted to turn the floor over to you, Catherine, to introduce yourself and talk through some of that. I think you're on mute. Awesome.
Sorry. So I'm Catherine McLean, founder and CEO of Dillon Green. We are a recruitment company focused on the clean energy transition. I've been in the space for about 15 years. A very large chunk of that was over in Europe. I am based just in Northern Virginia outside the DC area, and I basically help companies diversify their candidate pools. I guess just going back to the question of what kind of tips I can give companies who are wanting to get more involved in DEI hiring, is that I would really have to say that why you have to really sit down with your team and figure out why is this important to us? Because I think that people will have different views on what DEI is. And I think you need to have open conversations with them about what does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? And then as a company, come up with what you think your values should be around DEI. And I think once you've done that internally, you then need to communicate it externally. I will say that the best way to communicate it externally is to be diverse. So you can have the best DEI strategy on your website, but if it's a bunch of white guys in the, exec leadership team, candidates are going to see right through that. I had a candidate yesterday who was, I was trying to convince her to look at this role I was working on. And I was like, oh, they're committed to diversity. And she's like, no, I'm not seeing that, Catherine. Just not seeing that. I was like, because for them, their pronouns are they and them. So for them, what was important to them was the inclusion piece, right? Could they have got hired? Yes. But what does the inclusion piece look like? And I think that's the other thing that companies forget about is they get really excited that they've hired this token diverse person. And now what? Right? They feel there's no sort of support network within the firm. So it's something very important to consider. And I think that if you want to create that sort of support network, that you probably need to look at it not on a role by role basis, but on like a hiring strategy basis, right? So like we have 10 roles. We are committed to 8 of those roles. We are going to do everything we can. So if we are successful, we are bringing people in that are diverse with other diverse people so they feel included, right? And the other thing I will say is training and development. So, some of the other things that you really need to think about is, if we have 2 candidates and one is diverse and fits 75% of the JD, and one is not diverse and fits 100% of the JD, do we have the training and development where we can put our arm around that person and get them that extra 25%? And if the answer is yes, then that's your answer. That's where you should be focusing your efforts on, because Lord knows that non-diverse people have had lots of times they've not been fully qualified for the job and still got the job, So it's been happening for a long time. So I think that's the other thing that really is one of the hardest parts of my job, being trying to convince companies like, yes, I understand that they don't have as much experience as Bill, but you did ask me for XYZ and this, and they do have all of that. And so isn't there a way that we can get there? And I think that the final thing I'll say is watch out for the bottlenecks, because in my experience, the bottlenecks tend to be middle management. So usually you have the board on board and you have HR on board, and then you have middle management, which does not want to be told what to do. And so if they are not bought in, they will find a way to passively aggressively sabotage your DEI hiring. And I know this sounds like very doom and gloom, but there are ways to mitigate that when you're aware that that could happen. So, this candidate is absolutely perfect for the job. Why aren't we taking them forward? I'm still waiting on feedback from the hiring manager. Week 2, candidate really seems spot on for that role. Oh, the hiring manager just can't seem to get a hold of them. So, then they finally get back to you and the candidate's off the market. These are like delay tactics, right? So it's important to be aware of it and sort of navigate it through it as a recruiter who, this is what I do for a living. It can be very frustrating, but if you're aware of it, you can sort of get around it. So
that's really interesting and way to keep it real in the discussion.
Just one more thing I'll say. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
The other thing I want to mention quickly is, what does diversity look like? So, for example, there are a lot of times that I get calls from clients who will say, we actually have a lot of women, Catherine. We have 50% women, but we are very white organization. And we would just like to really have people from other backgrounds and other ethnicities. They don't necessarily have to be women, right? So I think I always say to companies, okay, you're hiring me. Are you hiring me because you have no women in the organization? Or are you hiring me because where is it that you are trying to increase diversity? Like what does that look like to you? Right. So it's the other thing I would say.
I've got 2 questions or comments based on what you just said. Thank you so much. The first is on the middle management question. Again, going back to what Quionna said about change management, I do think, and I've read through, for example, the Carbon Capture Hub strategy that is being promulgated by the government, and certainly the Inflation Reduction Act. Fundamentally, if people want to participate, if companies want to participate in these programs, there is significant diversity and community outreach components. I know for the Carbon Hub, you can't do it unless you've got a very robust and significant community outreach program to wrap in people of diversity. And so I think it sounds to me like, this may or may not be right, but that strategic piece is starting with, you know, the board, but not finding its way down through the ranks. It's not being, DE&I is not being embedded, in other words, in people's KPIs.
I will say, like, it is a lot of times like the VC or like the PE company will call me to get involved to help with like the portfolio company because they are being held accountable financially for these benchmarks. Noticed a huge uptick in that the past year, which is very interesting. But then I've also noticed some hostility with the portfolio companies. So it's I think it depends on who the audience is. Like if you're talking about a large developer with 400 or 500 people in the US and you're a director within that, so very much middle management, you aren't thinking strategically, thinking about like the, you know, like
getting through the day or whatever.
And the other thing is you're kind of talking about two different things with the Inflation Reduction Act. You're talking about one, investing in projects including DEI within the suppliers, within the communities, etc. That's a different kettle of fish compared to like internal DEI. And so there are no benchmarks within, as far as I'm aware, the IRA that says that the developers themselves have to be diverse, right? They're talking about where they're investing needs to be.
The interesting connection, and part of the reason why we're having this webinar, is to say, how do you integrate with community? How do you talk to communities if you have no lived experience with none of the people in your company?
This is what's interesting is I've had clients say, we would really like a Hispanic Latino person, Catherine. Oh, okay. Why is that? Well, we're starting to realize that, like, you know, we're talking to communities and that don't really speak English that we need to be engaging with, and it would probably be helpful. You know, like it's just dawning on them. It's like, okay.
I would like to ask the second question I had is on your mind, is there any success story, any story of candidate that successfully did integrate, and you know, any tips that you have from that?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily couldn't think of a success story where the candidate successfully integrated. I mean, I wouldn't think of it like that, but I can think of success stories where, especially with African American women, I've got them a hell of a lot more money than they were on because we didn't have to say what they were on. So this whole nonsense of like, tell me what you're on currently, and then it just self-perpetuates that you're underpaid your entire career. So now that we've stopped that, and the companies are getting clever, you know, they don't want me now to tell the salary range. Like I no longer am allowed to do that. Then they want to know what the candidate wants first before they tell them what the salary range. Yeah, they're trying their best to get around this. But ultimately, the moment that all these different states, I think we're up to almost 20 states, started to say you cannot ask what somebody is on, is the moment I started getting women more money, especially women of color. And so I will say to my candidates, and who are especially women, I will say to them, you tell me what you're on, and then you don't tell anybody else what you're on. And then I will make sure that you are going to get exactly what you deserve for this position. But I just need to know from for my own knowledge, like where you're at and like what we're dealing with here. And I think that has just been so incredibly rewarding for me. So that's probably, been my favorite part of the job so far.
It's really, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work that you do.
Thanks.
Beth, I'd like to turn it over to you because I know you've got some good case studies to talk us through.
Great. Thank you, Helen. And there's so much. I had, thoughts already, of course, based on what we've discussed. But after everything Quionna and Catherine have said, I have all these other thoughts. So I'll try to be very brief and to the point. So in terms of embedding DEI, well, first of all, just to let people know briefly, Beth Gullette, I'm Chief People Officer, which is another name for the head of HR for a health tech company. So I'm not actually in the climate tech sector, but it is a Series B company. We've got about 160 people now, and I've been there since the beginning. So from built up to this point, and we promise to go bigger. And so I've had a lot of real helpful successes and failures over the past 4.5 years in this particular setting in doing this work and embedding it. So, so what I'd like to do is just share a few thoughts on kind of what I think the steps are to embed equity into an organization and into business practices, and then kind of share some of the concrete examples of how we've done that at Well, which I think are perfectly applicable to any other organization and sector. So it very much, I think, reiterates what Quionna and Catherine said. My first key step in embedding equity in the business is articulating a why for you to focus on equity. Why is your organization focused on equity? Number 2 would be to identify and focus on specific outcomes that matter, which Quionna also emphasized. And then number 3 is measure, track, and report on progress towards those outcomes to stay accountable and to have a long-term view on things, which again, Quionna noted, because there are many aspects of embedding equity in an organization that take time and that take persistence. So those 3 things I think are really important. And so if you think about the why, for me, this is really important to align on the why of doing this, because it gives you with your other founders, leaders, your organization, it gives you sort of a North Star for what outcomes to set, et cetera, and it gives motivation and incentive. So for me personally, the why is because it's a human and a civil rights issue. And that to me is a moral issue. So yes, there are important business cases, and yes, there are data that show, X, Y, and Z, but for me, that's where I start. So human and civil rights issue. And with that kind of moral framing, there are no boundaries in terms of where the work should stop or begin. And so for me, and I think this is important as we think about equity, and it's already been touched on as well, but yes, it's about equity within the organization. It's about equity, creating equity and having an influence on equity in the communities you're in as a business or as an entity. And it's about having an influence, making an attempt to improve equity externally with whatever you do as a business or entity, your product, your service, et cetera. So that's kind of how I think about it. So, and I think all 3 of those stakeholder groups are highly interconnected or intertwined and even synergistic. And as has been noted, if you are going to deal with something that, in our case, for example, improving health outcomes, obviously that has to happen across the board. Everybody needs health outcomes improved, and particularly communities of color, marginalized, underrepresented groups tend to have particularly negative outcomes with the healthcare system and whatnot. And so for us, not only is it important to have a broad and diverse view of who our constituents are, we call them members, but our customers, but it's really important for us to recognize the various issues at play that we have to take into account from a strategic perspective in meeting the needs of different constituency, like social determinants of health, health disparities, health equity issues, and then that's synergistic with our internal equity work, because we need an employee organization who can understand those issues and who can speak to them and who can bring solutions to them. So we have to have people with diverse perspectives, lived experience, language capabilities, you name it, right? That multifaceted sort of diverse perspective to be able to deliver those things. And we believe, and this is maybe somewhat more of the kind of the moral argument, we also believe that it's important to have a lens toward equity in the communities we're in, because we are benefiting from, you know, the business community of which we are a part. We are benefiting from the local and state government, where our offices are based, and we recognize that there's a history to the neighborhoods that we are in, and in some cases there was displacement of communities of color in particular in the history of where our buildings now stand. And so taking into account those various issues really broadens, I think, the why, and gives some real opportunity for alignment. And to Quianna's point, I think that is why some group education initially is such a good idea, because having some sense of history, what got us here, why are things the way they are in society, why is it more challenging to recruit certain roles than others, if you want diversity in those roles. Understanding the systems of, you know, economic discrimination, housing, education, criminal justice, employment, et cetera, those help to give you a perspective on, you know, kind of the antecedents of the issues we're facing today. And to me, those can inform our solutions somewhat. So let me give you a concrete example. If we want to, well, let me say this first. So with those as kind of the steps, we at Well did some alignment work and then said, okay, so what are the things we're committed to doing as part of building equity? And so we identified 3 kind of goal areas, one of which, the first two, in fact, kind of reflect our internal focus, organizational focus. The third is more about the customers we serve. And those first 2 are not rocket science. We hear them all the time: diversity, and then inclusion and equity. We combine 2 into 1. The diversity one, though, the important part, in my view, is we said we want to diversify our talent at all levels and in all functions, because we already are fairly diverse in more of our entry-level jobs, member-facing jobs, but less so in some of the higher paid wealth building jobs and in, for example, the technology roles. And so that one of the things that was very helpful in understanding why that was to do some of this historical learning together as a team about, you know, the history of technology education in the United States, and the fact that higher education in the 20th century was closed off to, you know, women and minorities to a very large extent. And when it was available, it tended to be in things like teaching and ministry, et cetera, and not in things like engineering. And so, and then when there were colleges that began to have engineering programs, then there wasn't the federal funding, you know, from the scientific organizations that promoted research and development, and that were hugely influential in spawning engineers in the second half of the 20th century, software engineers in particular, in our view. So really, HBCUs and other colleges that focused on engineering and were open to people of color and women, for example, that came late, like not too many decades ago, which means we're really far behind in that pipeline of talent. And so that is really important for me as I think about a recruitment strategy. Really critical to find out which HBCUs have engineering programs, because there's going to be a much larger critical mass to go to of high quality, highly trained engineers of color. Which universities in our sort of catchment areas where we're recruiting have chapters of, for example, the National Society of Black Engineers or National Society of Hispanic Engineers. So, so knowing the history and knowing that it's going to be really important to be very strategic also helped us to begin to see, oh, and we're also going to have to do a lot proactively to fill the top of the funnel in recruitment so that when we do have a posting, we have a lot of candidates available to us. We have to do a lot from a strategy standpoint to build relationships with some of these organizations and to be to have a mutually beneficial relationship where we're providing technical education and help and mentoring, and we're also recruiting. And this is part of then developing an employer brand that is more inclusive and is seen as more equitable in terms of, you know, landing there and getting a job. So that's an example of how some of these things kind of fit together, I think. So I talked about the why and some of that and whatnot. And in terms of those outcomes, I also mentioned the importance of tracking, measuring, et cetera. So I'll share one more example of how we've embedded that at Well. And that is that we have created action plans that support each of those sort of commitment areas, diversifying at all functions and levels. The second one is about creating an inclusive, informed organization with equitable practices and systems. So we packed in a lot there, but it really is important to have that informed piece, because otherwise, if we're just rolling out programs or setting goals, et cetera, and there's no ongoing mechanism for promoting understanding of why these things are important, then at some point we start to bump up against resistance and lack of understanding, kind of like Catherine's point, that middle management layer where, you know, they're not as bought into that compelling why, because it needs to be something that gets ongoing promoted through change management, right? So tracking and whatnot is really important to these action plans. So as one example, I won't go into all of them because each one we have lots of examples. Things, for example, well, I'll say a couple examples. So the first one, diversifying at all levels and functions. I talked a lot about recruitment strategy, but then once people are on board, what's their experience like? So we work very hard on the experience of psychological safety. Part of that is recruiting in cohorts so that people do feel a sense of inclusion from the beginning, and at least somebody who's kind of a buddy. We also provide peer mentors for all new hires outside of the area to provide a buddy, but also to help people understand the business. We also really focus a lot on career development, internal promotion. So we have an internal strategy for diversifying at levels and functions as well as external. And that has a lot to do with mentoring and coursework, support for learning and development, et cetera. So on that front, we've rolled out 4 paid learning days per year, so that people can do learning that enhances their career and they get paid for it. So 4 extra days in addition to PTO. Similarly, to make that community connection, we rolled out 2 paid volunteer days off. Now, some tech organizations may have unlimited PTO and stuff, so that may seem less important. For us, we have an hourly workforce and a salaried, so we did not want to have 2 sort of classes. So we have the same PTO policy for both, and so that really led us to have a PTO. We can't do unlimited with hourly because of wage and hour laws and overtime and all of this. So but that also gets to this this other focus, I'll say, which is that when you're focused on outcomes, well-being, success for everybody, absence of discrimination, absence of mistreatment, if those are your goals, and those are essentially the definition of equity, then you simply look through that lens with all of the policies, procedures, practices, systems that you create in your organization. And that is how you build equity. So a policy, for example, same PTO policy, regardless of pay status. Similarly, parental leave policy. We have the same parental leave policy, regardless of gender, regardless of how the child comes into your life, whether it's adoption, foster, birth, and regardless of whether you're the birth parent or not. And so this does a couple of things. This ensures that families have healthy time together at the beginning, and it's a generous policy of 4 months off paid leave. So families get parents at home. Parents don't get overwhelmed and burned out quickly. And it also, this is a more subtle one, but from a gender diversity standpoint, if you think about this at all levels and all functions, when you have a birth parent policy and a different policy for the non-birth parent, you typically have a policy for birth mothers and or the birth partner in a non-heterosexual relationship. But oftentimes it's birth mother gets the time off, birth father does not. And one of the insidious things that happens with a policy like that is women of childbearing age are seen as a bit more risky, and they take exit ramps to have kids, and then they come back in and their careers don't advance to the same degree as their male counterparts. And so if males are in the same boat and everybody has the same policy, the same time off, then everybody's the same risk. And, there's equal, taking of exit ramps and coming back on. And so that's the kind of thing where you're just taking an equity lens to a policy to ensure that you're thinking through the implications and the consequences of the policy. And it's been fantastic. So those are a few of the things that I'd say. And the last thing in terms of tracking, we have put in place measurements that measure us as a company on these action plans, and things like pay equity. So we do compensation analysis to make sure that we're paying equitably. We are measuring ourselves on our demographic distribution, gender and racial makeup, and we are publishing these things as well as all the other targets. But we're publishing these to employees on a quarterly basis with charts and everything. And we're publishing them to the board on a quarterly basis, and we're publishing to the leadership team.
Like a DE&I quarterly report or something.
Yeah, that's exactly
what it's called.
Yeah, it's
wow.
DE&I quarterly update.
Oh my gosh, that's cool.
So we have that now. Of course, these things take time. If you started out as a not very diverse. Now we've had pretty good equity in a lot of the areas we measure, but in terms of diversity, that is taking more time, especially, as I said, with that sort of engineering orientation. But what we do is then we say, okay, here it is, and here's where we're weak, here's where we're strong. And so the other piece that this does is it forces you to reassess your action plans. If you're weak in an area, you're not achieving success, and to just be flexible and keep trying to do better, keep talking about it, keep trying to do better. So now we've incorporated a item in our semi-annual performance review that assesses people on their contribution to an equitable workplace. So that could look like recruiting help if you're in HR or a hiring manager. It could look like different building respect or whatnot on your team, and showing respect for people. It could look like different things, but we measure it now. So what gets measured, right? Yep, gets managed. And so So anyway, those are the kinds of things that we've done that are really concrete, that are outcome oriented, and that we keep looking at and that we hold ourselves accountable to. And that really is how you embed DEI. Now, to Catherine's point, that doesn't mean that, oh my God, we're this perfect organization that just represents every ideal we are striving for. No, we've still got some pockets where I think we're way above a lot of companies, but we still have work to do, and we always will. So it's an ongoing journey.
Beth, thank you so much. There's so many good points in that. What an amazing amount of commentary here. I want to make sure that Tots has time to give her story and her talking through what she has to say. So I'm going to suggest, because we may not have time for questions, it just depends on where we get, but I just put our post on this event from the Women in Climate Tech global page into the chat. If you guys want to access that as you think of questions, I'm sure you'll go away and digest this and come back with questions. This will be an easy way to get in front of the whole group of us and have a conversation, continue the conversation on LinkedIn if you would like to, just in case we don't have enough time. But I just want to invite you to follow our page and submit comments or questions on there. Thank you so much, Beth. Tots, so wonderful to have you here, and would love to hear a bit about your role and the KPIs that you are working to in that role.
All right, so I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is a program that was started in 2020 by my employer, the American Forest Foundation. And when I first came to the organization, I was our Southern Regional Director for the Family Forest Carbon Program. I transitioned into being the first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director for the organization this past October. And so my role within that is really to make sure that our program is responsive to landowners outside of the dominant identity groups. Landowners meaning for family forest owners, the sort of target market for the Family Forest Carbon Program. KPIs are working on KPIs right now. So for our organization, our DEI journey really did start more from an HR perspective. Our VP of People and Culture, I think she was just called our HR director prior, but now she's our VP of People and Culture, had commissioned a study to be done about our organization and to really understand about our company culture. And what came out of that report was that we needed to do some work in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that person has since organized a number of sort of trainings for our staff around microaggressions, around just inclusivity, and having sort of a open mindset and open dialogue, and engaging in sort of that interpersonal sort of DEI work. And so most of our work as an organization has been from that perspective. I'm the first person to now be in charge of making sure that we think about DEI from the perspective of our programs and what our programs are doing. So I don't really deal with the HR thing at all. I just deal with who the participants are in our program, and formulating our strategy around working with landowners and making sure that landowners are able to thrive, especially landowners who have been historically underserved or historically marginalized, not necessarily from our program, but just in terms of the forest products industry in general. Although we do definitely want to make sure that our program is actually representative of what landowners look like in the regions that we serve. And that's one of the things that I'm working to do, is develop our strategy around that. Like I said, I came into this role in October. I organized our first DEI summit this past March. And so I was really thinking about that because of what Quionna said earlier about, when you ask the question about who should you invite into this kind of work, and Quionna basically said, like, depending on the size of your organization, you might really want to invite people who have an enthusiasm or excitement already. And that was exactly what happened with the summit that we did. So I was like, yes, ma'am, totally agree. Because, we have over 100 employees at our organization. It's grown really rapidly as we got into this carbon space. And so that's just really unwieldy in terms of inviting people into a summit and coming up with strategy for DEI for our organization. So people who have previously indicated that they were really interested in these issues or who had named things before, I just sort of invited them to come into this summit, and we got together over 3 days and really talked about what do anti-racist multicultural organizations look like? What have we been doing from a DEI perspective? What do we want to do? Where do we want to see our program going? What is diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice? Which parts of that do we want to get into? Because I just really noticed that we didn't really have a unified vision of what that work meant or why we wanted to have DEI work even being done in our organization or what were our goals. And so I feel like it was really important for us to just get on the same page. What is it that we're even talking about? What are we trying to do? And so that's what we did at that summit. And our strategy plan is still in development. Our E-team just went through the first draft review. And so now I'm going to be doing some further edits on that. And so I can't really name what are some of our specific key performance indicators because we're still working on drafting what those are going to be. But our program, I would say, was really developed in general out of noticing that there was a problem in the carbon market space in general, where it's only really been available to large, 2,500 plus acre landowners that really was predominantly industry folks and not small family forest owners. And since our organization has a history of working with small family forest owners, we felt like we would be really poised to bring carbon markets to those small family forest owners. And so we started out our program being open to a minimum of 30 acres of forest owners and a maximum of 2,400. We since removed that upper limit. But really all of that was bringing the program to smaller landowners. And so that in and of itself has an equity component to it, making sure that small landowners are able to engage in carbon programs. And now the next phase is how do we make sure that our program is responsive to landowners outside of the dominant? What do I mean when I say that? I mean white landowners, I mean elderly landowners, and I mean upper middle class landowners. So how can we get more than just that sort of segment, even within those small family forest owners, being able to participate meaningfully in our program and thrive within our program? And how can we remove barriers, thinking not just only about their experience in terms of our program, but also looking at the broader systemic justice issues that face landowners of color, and really starting to address those things and make sure that we're working at a systemic level, in addition to what's going on within the small microcosm of what happens within our program. And I really like what was said earlier too by Beth about, we don't really need to make sure that there's no boundaries around where we stop or where we start. So that was another thing that came at the summit. We're talking about being responsive to diverse landowners was, okay, well, where does it stop? We're talking about this intersectionality intersecting between these identity groups. When are we going to stop this? And I was like, why do we need to stop at any point? We really don't. So I really like when you said that earlier.
So many good ideas, and a couple of questions have come in. Beth, the DEI quarterly update, Kelly says she loves that idea. And one of the struggles is folks self-identifying in our HRIS. How do you encourage or get that demographic information for your workforce?
Yeah, Kelly, this is a great question, and it was a real puzzle for me at first. So for those of you who don't know, an HRIS is a human resources information system. So the system where everybody's information, name, demographic information, address, et cetera, is held. So, and that is, what we use to publish our demographic updates. So there is, it's optional for people to provide their information in that. We've got a standard kind of EEOC question, but it is optional. And so what I did, Kelly, and it's not a perfect solution, but it helped a lot, was for the first couple of updates, I went ahead and I published the charts. And one of the data points was, I forget what I call it. It's unreported or prefer not to answer or something. And it was a big category. And so I actually verbally presented the first update at an all hands meeting. And I pointed that out and I said, hey guys, in case you don't know, it's really important to fill this data out. We're just using it to make sure we get better. And so if you haven't filled that out, please do so. And then I kept reporting on that number along with the racial ethnic breakdown each time. And that gradually went down, 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 down. And now it's pretty negligible. So I don't know if that helps, but that was good for us.
Well, thank you. That seemed like such an important question. I wanted to make sure we got it in there. And Tots, what I heard, one of the strategies that you had was this event, this conference. Did you call it an equity conference where you brought people together, and that your leadership on that?
Or DEI Summit.
DEI Summit. And I love that idea too, as kind of a place to really bring the minds together. So many wonderful ideas that you all of us shared. I just want to end with very quickly, what gives you hope? And I'll talk about, I've got two girls, 17 and 14, and they give me hope because they see through a lot of this bullshit. And I'm happy for them to carry this through into the future and be change makers themselves. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? I don't want to pick on anyone.
I'll share in my work, what gives me hope for the conversations that we're having inside of organizations now that we were not having, years ago. So I'm really excited, and I'm hopeful about what is possible because of what we're talking about together and as organizations and as individuals.
Well, in addition to my work, at AFF, I also teach. And so I would say I definitely have every now and again a student who really inspires me. I teach undergraduates. And so I was just reading my student evaluations a couple of days ago, and one of my students wrote on there, I came into this class, I was teaching an apartheid class. So we talked about medical apartheid, food apartheid, and South African apartheid. And one of my students wrote, I came to this class not even knowing what apartheid was, and I left ready to dismantle the government. And I was like, I'm inspired, so that's the next generation.
I love it.
Getting comments like that brings me hope.
I just would say what brings me hope is I really do kind of feel kind of what you're saying about your kids. Like, I just feel like this next generation is just a way more open-minded, tolerant generation. And I just think they're they just have a lot less patience for this stuff. And I think that we're going to see a lot of changes, hopefully, as they mature and try and fix the legacy that we're leaving them. So
I would say all of those things also give me hope. On a sort of personal note, what gives me hope is how much I personally have grown and learned in a very short time, and how transformative it's been for me, and how I've been able to then incorporate it into my work and into my volunteer activities. And that to me is an indication of how possible it is to reach people and to activate people through empathic dialogue and education, and tapping into values and shared goals and alignment. So that gives me hope.
So honored to have all of you here. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure we will get good comments from the people who were on. And just thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you for the work that you do. It's so important.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.